have to tell this people. Okay. Hearing no comments, we'll proceed with the agenda. Welcome, everybody. How about the minutes from the February 16 meeting? They've been posted. They were pretty thorough. Any comments people have on those, corrections that are needed? Hearing none, we'll deem those minutes approved. Our first, we've got two major topics, well, really three major topics today. A report on VTrans work, on the carbon reduction strategy, a report on the ANR and PSD work with respect to thermal sector qualitative analysis of policy options. And then I hope we'll have some time at the end to discuss future meetings and work plans for the committee, things that you would, so while the committee meeting is going on, if you haven't done it yet, give some thought to what you would like to put on the agenda for upcoming meetings of this subcommittee. Anything else that people want to put on our list for today? All right, then. Let's just dive into the transportation.
Sorry, Rich, if we could, I think the process has been to hand off and go around for note takers, minute takers for the meetings. So thanks, Megan, for throwing that in the chat. Anybody want to volunteer to be a minute taker?
I did it last time. It's not that hard.
I will promise to do it next time, but I have to leave. Today I won't be here the whole time, so.
I will do it.
All right, thanks, Joey.
It forces you to pay attention. I'm
I
sure.
always pay attention, Gina.
I know, I do too.
Thank you, TJ. So TJ, would you like to do the handoff here?
Sure. So in our last meeting, we started to get into an update on the work of that AOT is doing on the carbon reduction strategy. And we really gave it about 5 minutes. There was technical difficulties. And that was really because we were having such a good conversation with the weatherization folks and that component of the work. And so we thought it would be good to give a much more robust presentation and update on what's going on with the carbon reduction strategy and transportation's work there. So with that, I'm just going to turn it right over to Andrea to further introduce the topic.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I actually think it worked out for the better because we've been wanting to sort of get into some greater detail about how we came up with our methodology. And so Ben is here with me, Ben Eskin from Cambridge Systematics, and I'll just go over briefly some background on the work that we're doing, just to sort of remind everybody and ground everybody in the purpose and the intent and what we're working with. And then Ben will get into the methodology and sort of where we're going. So Ben, do you want to try to share your screen?
Yeah, let me do that. Okay. Can everyone see that screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There we go. Yep. Okay, good. Yep, me and Ben. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so yeah, just as background, we are conducting this work with two primary objectives. The first is to support the requirements for greenhouse gas emissions reductions as laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and especially with a requirement for transportation sector to contribute 40% of the state's emissions reduction targets. And so that's our first objective. And then the second is to support the federal requirements for each state to develop a carbon reduction strategy to most cost effectively implement the carbon reduction program funds. And just, we don't have a slide on this, but just quickly, the carbon reduction program provides Vermont with $32 million over the 5 years of the IIJA, which is years 22 through 26. And like I said, we need to develop a strategy for the use of those funds that's consistent with the guidance that was put out. And the guidance calls for projects and programs that are looking at reducing traffic congestion, looking at travel demand options, so ways to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips, looking at fleet electrification and the charging infrastructure that goes along with that, and even looking at construction methods and materials, and all to result in lower carbon emissions eventually. And so it really talks about like what is in VTrans control. But there was one part in the guidance that said the carbon reduction strategy shall support the reduction of transportation emissions of the state. And so we took sort of a broad reading of that, and we are looking beyond the agency's projects and programs to what other policies might be implemented statewide to achieve those required reductions. Go ahead to the next slide. So we are taking a two-phase approach to this work. The first, and you've heard about this, but just as a reminder, the first phase is to develop a methodology for evaluating the effect of the agency's capital programs on greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at what research is out there, understanding what other states are doing, what existing tools there are that we could use in this methodology, and then developing our own methodology and a tool that can be used into the future by VTrans staff to estimate the impacts of our programming. And then the second phase is to sort of take that baseline that we're working from and that we got from the methodology and that initial evaluation, and then understanding the gap that exists to meet the needed reductions, and then looking at the strategy again to support the most cost-effective implementation of the carbon reduction program funds through the agency programs, but also looking for the reduction of transportation sector emissions of the state. So kind of twofold there, looking at our programs and again, looking at the state and other strategies that can be implemented. Yep, you can go to the next one. So our project timeline, showing that here, we put together a technical committee, and that committee has met 4 times since around the beginning of September. And that committee is comprised of members with experience and expertise in the greenhouse gas inventory, transportation and energy modeling, and people that have other data and analysis research experience that's needed to sort of develop that quantitative analysis. And so that group has been most active during phase 1, and then during phase 2, they'll come back in and apply the methodology to the strategies that we come up with in phase 2. And then, so here we are in March. We also have an advisory committee that has just met once, and that group is going to look really focusing during phase 2 on the identification of strategies and the scenarios that will ultimately go into a recommendation in the carbon reduction strategy. Yeah, so we have been meeting last week and this week and next week with several different stakeholders, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. We also have a public meeting next week, and so that's kind of where we're at. After we hear from those groups, we'll reconvene with the advisory committee and decide which strategies we're going to go deep into an evaluation on. Next slide. Okay, and this is Ben.
Andrea, do you want questions now or after?
I think anytime you have questions, you can ask.
So I didn't see it on there, but presumably there's going to be kind of a final report sometime in the fall, or?
Yeah, so that's right. The carbon reduction program requirement is to have a strategy developed and approved by or submitted for approval by Federal Highway by November 15th. And we anticipate having a draft sometime in September, October timeframe. Yeah.
Right, okay. And so I just want to frame it up for this committee and for the council in terms of what kind of feedback and what the role of this committee should be, or what do you think the role of this committee should be? Right now, you're kind of informing us of what's going on. How should we think about that over the next several months?
Yeah, this is definitely just to inform you of sort of the work that went into the methodology. Our stakeholder outreach right now has been less on that and more hearing from people about what strategies they think we should further evaluate and include some sort of combination of those into our final recommendation. So I think that after the advisory committee, the next meeting where we sort of hone down what strategies we're going to look at, and this probably will dovetail nicely too with the thermal work that's being done, that we can sort of come back to you and provide the direction that we're going at. And there's some overlap in members of the committees. So a lot of people who are in this group will know the direction that we're choosing, but I think it would be good maybe end of April timeframe to come back and say, this is what we heard from the stakeholder groups. This is what the advisory committee is telling us we should look at more deeply. You know, does that jive with this group, and what other input there might be? So that's what I would think.
That makes sense. I have one follow-up, but Gina has her hand up.
My question's related to yours, TJ. What status does the CAP have in this process? The CAP and the transportation portion of the CAP. Is it just another report, or how is it being treated?
So these funds will go to support a lot of what is in the CAP for transportation strategies.
Okay.
I think we're still sort of determining all the, the policy recommendation that might be evaluated. But it's looking,
I mean, the CAP has a lot of recommendations in it, and it went through a process. It can always go through more process, obviously, and it would hugely benefit, I think, from more process. But it is a body of work that the Climate Council has approved.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I don't, our group especially, but several groups in VTrans, everything we're doing, we're kind of tracking towards how it impacts the CAP and where it will get us.
Okay.
And, we still have to work more with A&R as they develop the tracking and progress tool and stuff like that. But yeah, the pathways in the CAP are what we're all aiming for. So I think they're very much intertwined.
okay, that's good to know. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to see what comes out of from these stakeholder groups and what the advisory council or committee moves us forward on. But I think we have to keep in mind what was recommended in the transportation space as well. So hopefully all those things line up, but we can come back to you and you guys can let us know if they don't, or we should be moving in a different direction. Go ahead, Joey.
Just quickly, building off of that, I appreciate the answer. Are you in your outreach making clear to the stakeholders that after a year's process in the addendum, the Climate Council recognized that one or more of a combination of cap and invest or performance standard would likely be required?
It's not explicitly stated in the stakeholder groups that we've had so far, but those recommendations are discussed. So those are definitely two of the things that we go over and seek input on.
I mean, it just feels like it should be important to underscore with folks that this is what the council identified is to make certain that we achieve those targets, it's likely going to be one or more of a combination of those things, just to make I'm sure it's in there. I hope so.
Go ahead, Bran.
So I'm squatting in an entrance way in the state house. So I apologize if there are people going in and out and background noise and so forth. One sort of big question that I had is closely related to all this, which is, that piece in the guidance that you guys grabbed onto, reducing emissions. We have discussed that there is, I think, a majority of us who don't believe we can achieve the needed transportation reductions without, as Joey said, either a performance standard or a cap and trade based on all the data available to us globally. And, I think we can sort of be open about the fact that the administration has been pretty skeptical about either of those. So, realistically, I think we need to sort of try to assess sort of honestly and realistically with each other, how likely is it that there will be one or the other of those in the carbon reduction plan? And if it's unlikely, I mean, we can sort of honestly say, listen, the governor and the administration are deeply skeptical, and it's very unlikely those will make it. If that's true, and I'm not assuming it is, but if it is, if we sort of all say, yeah, that's the way it's most likely to shake out, then we as a subcommittee have the question as to whether we want to work in parallel to develop a recommendation of one of the other of those two, or whether we want to wait until November 15th and then build on the CSP when it comes out.
Yeah, I think I can't imagine that we aren't going to be evaluating those two things as a potential. I don't know what that will look like. I think that's a conversation that we need to have at the advisory committee of what the options are to evaluate in those sort of spaces, the cap and invest and the standard. But we have tried our best to make sure that we have representatives from a variety of entities so that we do hear, we're not like just putting a bunch of people who are going to think exactly the way the administration thinks or anything like that. I mean, we have heard a bit about cap and invest and transportation standard, probably the most yesterday in the Transportation for Vermont stakeholder group that we went to yesterday. But then we still have the advisory committee to go to, and like I said earlier, considering the recommendation from the CAB. I can't imagine that we're not going to be looking at those options in an evaluation, and we're looking for, we're looking at co-benefits in those strategies that we're going to evaluate, and we're looking at the potential for ongoing revenue sources with those. So if you look at the gamut of strategies, there's only so many of those that will provide those outcomes. So,
well, thank you for explaining that and clearing away some of my ignorance. It's a big job, but it helped a little bit, so thank you.
I'd invite any other member of the administration to speak to that as well. and Jane is on, I'm trying to think of all the members that are on the advisory committee. Jane is, Megan is, Joey is. That's the advisory committee. I think Jared and Jared and Gina, I'm sorry, we're on the technical committee. So we've got a lot of different folks representing. Go ahead, Jane.
Thanks. I raised my hand when Joey spoke up and wanted to respond to that, but after Bram's comment, I guess I'll make two comments. One, I'm not going to steal Brian's thunder, but because Brian's going to talk about the policy options for the buildings and thermal analysis, but the policy options that we are looking at for the building's thermal sector include a performance standard and a cap and invest, and they also include a cap and invest for all fuels. And there's a necessity to coordinate the carbon reduction strategy and the buildings and thermal analysis to ensure that there's a lot of things in the air, a lot of policies being considered. If certain things don't move forward, it certainly would make sense to align the two sectors. Or that's our understanding and what we expect a quantitative analysis to illuminate for us, that there are efficiencies in trying to realize emissions reductions across sectors, not sector by sector. So we're hoping to align those analyses. And I think that, Joey, your point is a really good one about the CAP addendum. And I certainly think that the CAP addendum is something that we should be signaling and talking about those policies as options when we meet as an advisory board and further consider the carbon reduction strategy. But probably don't need to remind you or anyone else that, there was this chicken or egg thing about a predetermined outcome of what the policy was by the administration. So we certainly want to evaluate those and expect or consider, especially based on the professional judgment used to put those two forward, that those will look very good once they're analyzed, but we certainly want to make sure that they're evaluated across the board against other policies and costs and benefits. And that's what we'll do through both the carbon reduction strategy and the buildings and thermal study. And I think that'll be really good information as we move forward.
Thanks, Jane. And I do want to provide plenty of time for Ben to get into the methodology so that you guys can understand what we've done so far on this and how it's going to lead into phase 2 here. So I'd invite you, Ben, to take it away.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to be conscious of time. I can sort of pick up the pace if we need to get to other things on the agenda. But yeah, hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Ben Eskin. I'm with Cambridge Systematics. We're the consultant team that's been doing a lot of the analytical work for sort of phase 1 and going into phase 2 of the carbon reduction strategy. And so, yeah, phase 1 of this has been sort of understanding the impacts of the VTrans capital program as it relates to the emissions in the whole sector and looking forward. So what did we look at in phase 1? So in terms of understanding the impacts of the capital program, it's kind of broken down to 2 major categories. The first is sort of the emissions attributable to the agency. So that's things related to construction and maintenance of assets, as well as emissions related to operations of assets such as public transit. And then the second big category is how programmed projects within the capital budget might affect system user emissions. So these would be breaking into categories like what is the effect of projects and programs on vehicle miles traveled. So investments in bicycle and pedestrian might reduce vehicle traffic. Projects that tackle operational efficiency and reduce traffic delay might reduce fuel use and emissions, or projects that tackle technology would also reduce emissions through investments in EV infrastructure and those types of investments. So how did we sort of look and estimate? Oops. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a quick echo, so I just paused, but I'll just ignore that. So in terms of tools and sources that were used, the first is going to be looking at, we did an inventory of all of our on-road surface transportation. And what we saw was we looked at the vehicle miles traveled, fuel efficiency, and electrification assumptions based on Vermont's climate action plan modeling. And we also complemented that with data from the US Department of Energy's Argonne National Laboratory. And then in order to estimate the effects of the capital program, again, we looked at the agency emissions. We used FHWA's infrastructure carbon estimator tool to look at construction and maintenance emissions. And then we use data from the National Transit Database to understand public transit emissions. And finally, in order to understand the change in system user emissions, we employed a spreadsheet sketch tool that we've actually developed as part of the Transportation Climate Initiative work that I think Vermont had been part of. And that provides some rough estimates on reductions. And I'll go into that in a second. So some of the baseline assumptions for us in terms of just doing a transportation greenhouse gas emissions inventory, again, we're looking at data assumptions from CAP workbook modeling, Argonne, and EAN grid analysis. Here's just a small sample of some of the key parameters. This is by no means comprehensive, but just to sort of show you some of the assumptions about passenger fuel economy. Very notably, you'll see passenger car electrification. So this baseline forecast assumes the adoption of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule and the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. And as a result, you can see 2025, we've got about 8% of the passenger cars electric. By 2030, we're about a quarter, and we're at around 93% by 2050. The electric grid emissions, again, we took from previous analysis. Vermont's got a very clean grid comparatively, and so those estimates were employed. And then vehicle miles traveled estimates, again, were taken from some of that climate action plan baseline analysis. So then again, looking at the actual VTrans capital program, we took a snapshot to understand all of the currently programmed projects in the capital program. This sort of is a rough graphic representation of the number of projects within categories. The vast majority are things related to paving, bridges, and roadway projects. And again, for those types, we used the FHWA tool to understand construction and maintenance emissions. But again, there were other projects related to traffic and safety, bicycle pedestrian, that we did separate calculations for. So I wanted to give a quick run through this. This starts to get a little bit technical, but just as an example of how do we estimate this kind of change in user emissions. So for example, when VTrans makes a bicycle and pedestrian investment, how are we calculating the change in emissions associated with it? So what we did is we used the sketch tool and we summarized, for example, how many new bike lanes are is VTrans currently programmed for. And it's not only broken out by facility type, but broken out by area type. So the impact of a new bicycle facility in an urban area is going to be different from a suburban area and from a rural area. And we summarized here, this table showing the number of lane miles. So for example, currently in the capital program, we've got 4.5 new miles of shared use path in the suburban facility. This really big number here in the corner is showing that we've got over 400 miles of widened shoulders. That is a bit of a programmatic assumption talking to the people in the capital program, because they wanted to assume that that was part of a bicycle strategy, that every single roadway that was tagged for a type of pavement resurfacing would have a widened shoulder to accommodate bikes. Again, it's going to have a small effect, but I just wanted to sort of show that as one note. And in order to kind of go through this sketch calculation, we would take a sample input. So we have, for example, the number of new bike miles in a suburban facility. In the capital program, we've got about 0.5 mile of new bicycle facilities. And what we did is this tool that we've created has some sketch factors that were taken from extensive literature review and analysis to understand the number of new riders that new facility would attract. And again, this is differentiated by an area type. We would take the assumed prior mode share. Again, this is taken from the literature, and trip length to understand the avoided VMT from that investment. So in this case, that would avoid about 14 vehicle miles traveled daily. And then in order to calculate the avoided emissions, we would understand the emissions associated with that based on the vehicle profile. And in this case, this is a small example, but this is the amount of metric tons avoided from that specific strategy. I can pause there, but I'm gonna actually go into like where all of these results are, and we can kind of pause for questions after. But big picture here is kind of what we see with the Vermont 2022 emissions. So about 3.45 million metric tons, about 70% of that is going to be passenger car and light duty trucks. 27% is going to be heavy duty and medium duty trucks, with the remaining split between public transit, construction and maintenance, and rail. Projecting into the future, we've got, again, just under 3.5 million in 2022. That starts to decrease gradually in 2025 and 2030, and then drops off rather dramatically by 2050. Again, this is a lot, almost entirely driven by the adoption of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. Again, in that previous slide, we had about 93% of the passenger cars electric by 2050. And then understanding how the capital program fits in that, altogether is about 2,500 metric tons, majority of which are traffic operations, some bicycle and pedestrian, and a little bit of transit. But as you can tell here on this, it's about less than 0.1%. So it's going to be a really small fraction of the current emissions profile of the transportation sector that is currently being sort of carved away by these projects in the Vermont capital program. So a few of kind of like the big picture takeaways from this analysis in phase 1 are that construction, maintenance, and transit are each about 1% of the statewide on-road emissions. The current effects of the capital program are really just set to reduce emissions by less than 0.1%. Higher electrification is always going to reduce the impact of that. So for measures that reduce vehicle miles traveled, the more electric vehicles there are on the road, the less the impact of those measures are going to have. So taking an electric vehicle off the road have a smaller impact than taking a fossil fuel powered car off the road. So it sort of demonstrates some of the limitations there. Okay, so that was a lot. We're going to pause. I'm sure there'll be comments and questions, so we want to just break here for a second. I think we've got a hand up. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks for that. I just have a question about that one chart of rectangles where I think it was numbers of programs or projects, right?
Yeah.
Do you have an equivalent chart that would show the tons of emissions associated with those projects, or is this is just numbers of things?
So this is the number of projects, just to kind of give a snapshot of what's in the capital program. But the emissions analysis that we had done is a little bit aiming to answer that question. So as I said, for things that are going to be construction and maintenance, that's going to be a lot of like all the roadway pavement and resurfacing and bridge construction. All of that was measured as part of that baseline. As we said, all the construction and maintenance is about 1% of total statewide emissions. So if all statewide emissions was about 3.5 million metric tons, the construction and maintenance portion was about 30,000. And then, as we said, the portion that was trying to affect user behavior, like bicycle and pedestrian, et cetera, that was only covering about 3,000 metric tons. So, an even smaller dent.
Okay, so I heard two messages there. One is it's relatively small fraction of total emissions. And as the fleet is increasingly electrified, it gets even smaller.
Correct. We've got another hand from Megan.
Thanks, Ben. Going back, I think a few slides to where you are now, the assumptions that that you made about the passenger car electrification percentages.
Mm-hmm.
Are those based on the, I guess, how did you come up with those percentages? I'm wondering if it's based on the sales mandate requirements under the Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Trucks rules, or is there some other layers there?
Yeah, so these assumptions were taken straight from the Climate Action Plan modeling. So we source spreadsheets directly from that previous analysis. And our understanding is that that models the adoption of Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks rule. So the sort of stock percentages and turnover of the fleet, I think, are reflecting those mandates.
Okay.
So that's where this electrification comes from. And I can answer if there are other sort of like specific ones about, I think light duty trucks looks similar, obviously a little smaller, and then medium and heavy duty trucks obviously lag much more in terms of the turnover. This is just sort of like a sample number to sort of, show some magnitude.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So unless there are other questions, I can sort of give, because I'm conscious of time, I can sort of just go on to briefly talking about phase 2, and then we can sort of continue on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so just laying out the process for the scenario analysis. Yeah, so the gap analysis, again, we'll start with the business as usual projection, which yeah, I think we're going to want to update to consider the advanced clean cars and trucks.
What is going on?
am I here? Yeah, I was like, am I hearing something? Hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry, hold on one second.
Yeah.
Let's try this again.
I feel like the slides might be tied to
Yeah, okay. Is audio okay right now?
yes.
Okay, I think something might have been going on with that slide. Anyway, this is where we are right now in the gaps analysis. So we're currently engaged in a gaps analysis to understand where our emissions and emissions projection are in line with the required reductions that are set out for the climate goals. So again, we've done the baseline, we've looked at it, and now we're evaluating where we're going to be compared to 2030 and 2050. And right now we're engaged in this process to understand how to close that gap in emissions. So the first element is just going to be identifying all the possible strategies that we want to consider, doing research on the benefits and co-benefits, and then developing a combined strategy to meet those targets. And all of this is being done with public and stakeholder input, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But there's a lot of feedback on these strategies. And once we've developed a scenario, we'll see how that compares with our targets. If we meet them, then great. And if we're not, we might have to do another round of iteration. And then all that will go into a recommended scenario. So as
And I'll just, Ben, if I could just add in there, just as a reminder that our scope of work called for one scenario that would be exclusively transportation, Agency of Transportation programs, and then one scenario that was exclusively policy and statewide, kind of looking at those, and then up to 2 more scenarios that can kind of combine them in different ways to see what we would come out with.
So we've been sort of currently in the middle of a series of stakeholder focus groups, and we're sort of completing this first round where we've been meeting with community organizations, environmental and equity groups, the business community, freight, environmental, regional planning groups, and elected officials. So this is all part of this first round of engagement to get their inputs. And these discussions have really been sort of, presenting this high level overview, and then in understanding how do we want to close these gaps to meet our mission goals, sort of having these discussions really surrounding these 5 main buckets of strategies. So the first is strategies related to mode shift. So it's bicycle, pedestrian, transit, micromobility, things like land use, teletravel, and TDM, other car and truck incentives and requirements, carbon management strategies. So that includes cap and invest and clean transportation standard, and then other sort of traffic and roadway strategies. So that's kind of what those discussions have really been centered around. And then Andre, you want to sort of talk about sort of the public engagement element as well?
Yeah, we have one more first round stakeholder group next week, and then on Thursday we will hold a public meeting, both at noon and at 6 p.m. just to hear from the public and anyone else who can join those who, or even if they have been involved in the stakeholder groups, they could join again. But yeah, just to hear from the public and hopefully engage them in a way that gets them to tell us what they need out of the transportation system that can also provide, carbon reduction. And I think we'll hear a lot about the other co-benefits of certain options, especially recognizing that a lot of what we can do with our transportation programs is limited in greenhouse gas emission reductions, as we've kind of seen here, but really looking at all the other co-benefits that might come from that. And so where we really want to strategize and putting these dollars.
So yeah, that was all we had, and we can have questions. It looks like Jared, you have your hand up.
Yeah, first, thank you for this work and this presentation, Ben. I did have a question before we get to the last couple of slides, which were kind of on understanding closing the gap. I have a question about how we understand what the gap is, because I think the way that you spoke about Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, there was an assumption that those regulations, that we're modeling every single car that's delivered to Vermont being placed in service in Vermont. And one of the things that I thought the Agency of Natural Resources team did a great job of in their rulemaking filings was making clear the difference between delivered to Vermont versus placed in service. So the rule will require auto manufacturers to deliver those vehicles to Vermont, but does not assure the funding that may be available for incentives to make sure that they're purchased, or for charging to make sure that they are kind of fully supported. And so, I think that A&R, correct me if I'm wrong, Megan or Colin or Jane, but I think in the rulemaking filing, it was very clear that that was a best case scenario, assuming that every vehicle delivered to Vermont under Advanced Clean Cars 2 is actually placed into service. But I think that there is this recognition and understanding that for that best case scenario to work out, it will require additional policies and programs to support all of those vehicles being put into service in terms of additional incentives, additional EV charging infrastructure, et cetera. So I'm just wondering how that gets handled, because I don't think we can just assume that all of those cars that get delivered get placed in service and then the gap is what's left. There's also a policy programs funding gap to ensure that all of those cars that will be delivered actually end up being placed in service.
Yeah.
That's my understanding of it. I would invite the folks from A&R to add or correct anything I may have misstated, but I just want to go back to, I think that was a best case scenario, and that there was an understanding that there likely would be additional programs, funding, et cetera, to make that best case scenario happen, and it can't just be assumed.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the comment. That's a really good point, and that's one of the reasons that we're actually not presenting like final numbers on the gaps, because we're actually currently wanting to sort of schedule these discussions to make sure we're like on the same page about understanding sort of how these projections relate to any gaps that might occur. And so, yeah, I think if there's anything else that we need to do to sort of like tailor projections. So for example, if this modeling is overly optimistic and we want to sort of calibrate that accordingly, yeah, that's a really good point. And that's going to put even more emphasis on understanding how incentives sort of actually push it to that overly optimistic. So all this is to say, like, yes, we want to have conversations, make sure we're aligned on those agreements, because all this is going to be essential to understanding, is it a small gap or is it a really big gap that we're going to have to be focused on in the next 5, 10 number of years. So no, I appreciate the clarification, and we're definitely going to have follow-up discussions on that.
Yeah. Jane, did you want to add to that? Or do you have another question?
Well, yeah, I was just going to comment. I would be actually curious to hear Jared and other members on the cross-sector subcommittee's feedback on this. But, as part of the buildings and thermal contract, we are working with SDI, who built the pathways analysis for the state for both the CEP and the comprehensive and the climate action plan, and working to update the business as usual model very comprehensively. And that deliverable was technically due yesterday, but we're holding out for one report, one additional report, the energy forecasting report, to make sure it's as accurate as possible and not automatically out of date. But I just feel very strongly that that is the modeling and the business as usual model that we have put together for the state. And that's something that we should align with this analysis rather than trying to recreate it and update it based on the work that you're doing here. So just for folks' benefit, we are meeting with our contractor and Cambridge Systematics. I always want to say, did I say it right? I always get confused between analytics and systematics. I say like the military contractor versus you guys.
Yeah, systematics. Correct.
Thank you. To align the work and understand what's happening over here on March 30th. So we're excited to sort of pull the two projects together, and the business as usual model updates that we're doing with SCI is something we certainly want to align the work with.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, that's kind of what I was trying to get at with my question earlier about the business as usual assumptions. And I honestly, I can't recall if the cap electrification scenario took into account the point that you made, Jared, and that we tried to reinforce in our rulemaking documentation. And I can't see on my screen if Colin is on or not, but I know that in separate conversations with Colin that we have communicated the point you made, Jared, to the thermal project contractor in their development of the BAU to make sure that, oh, Colin is on, sorry. But yeah, so I think we are carrying that forward at that point.
All right, thanks everybody for, is there anything more that's needed to, enhance coordination on the point that was just being made? Or Jane, are you just recommending we wait till March 30? See what that SEI report has to offer, and then maybe science and data could take a look at how to make sure that we're putting things in alignment.
My comment sort of about the committee is I just wanted a bit more acknowledgement that we all agree that the work that we've done with SEI and the work that we've done to build that business as usual model sort of is the underpinning for the future analyses in Vermont, and we'll continue to update that, and that is the model rather than sort of recreating it in other components. So I wasn't sure, just understanding that other people have expertise, that there's beyond mine, that there's sort of benefits to like having multiple models out there. But my assumption is that the SEI model is the business as usual model, and we should be working closely to align with that one.
Okay, so I'm not hearing any objections to that from the committee today, but my instinct is to say, sure, that sounds right. But the careful side of me also wants to say, maybe science and data can tell us whether there are some disconnects between different models that need to be discussed. So I'm pausing just before, we assume that everybody has agreed that the SEI report that we haven't seen yet is going to be the report.
Yeah. Are folks that are on the Science and Data Committee, is that part of the work plan at all? I mean, I feel like we talked about the business as usual model in this group and not in the Science and Data Committee, and kind of the modeling, before the cap was published was all really being discussed in that committee, like all the technical details, and it was just kind of the policies were in this committee, the cross sector. And so it may be worth for those folks that cross over to raise that and see if it should be part of the work plan at all to think about how these models are structured.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that it evolved is that, the update to the pathways model, the business as usual projections to account for additional policies and programs that have, come forward since that model was originally published, that kind of came about in alongside the buildings and thermal work. And so most of the kind of discussion of that modeling and those assumptions, there's been a little bit of that that's happened on the buildings and thermal task group. And I think at a minimum, that task group, which does have folks from science and data and from this subcommittee, should have a chance to review and provide feedback on the key assumptions. I mean, I generally agree with you, Jane, that like we don't want to have different competing models out there. We want to have one model that gets updated with the highest quality and best information as we go. But I also think that we shouldn't just assume that whatever's done is, you know, we need to have transparency around the review and assumptions, because a lot of these assumptions are really tricky, right? Like we were just talking about the one around vehicles delivered versus placed in service. I think there's also very difficult assumptions around Inflation Reduction Act incentives. I have seen analysis out there that assumes that just because an incentive is made available, that it gets taken advantage of. And the assumption is that people are rational economic actors. And we know that that there are barriers to taking up those incentives. And just because an incentive exists doesn't mean that we know this from years and years of data on efficiency programs and the programs that Efficiency Vermont or other efficiency utilities and utilities run. So I just want to be careful about making too simplistic of an assumption that just because an incentive exists that an individual household or business is going to take advantage of it, when there often need to be complementary programs and policies to leverage that and ensure that it happens. So that's just one example. My main point is, yes, one model, but we need transparency and a chance to review assumptions and have careful discussions about them.
Okay, Jared, I think the stage is set for science and data to take a look and let us know, you know, whether further conversation is needed.
I mean, one of the things we could do,
Jared, we're past the time for public comment, and I'd like to give members of the public an opportunity to ask questions or comment at this point. And I see Annette Smith's hand.
Thank you. I've been paying attention to the time. So I have a question that maybe for the modeler or for Andrea. I'm just wondering if it's possible to insert into the modeling the idea of doing something with commuter rail on the Western Corridor. And I've raised this before, and you know, there are a lot of us who think that the focus on just electric vehicles is not really going to do it. And because there is increasing congestion along the Western Corridor, like around Middlebury, and I mean, I dread the drive to Burlington now. It used to be 2 hours for me. Now I have to allow 2.5, and I just don't even want to go. And we have this beautiful rail corridor owned by the state. Now, is it, even if it's not something that is being considered in state policy, in terms of the emission reduction goals, would it be possible to model what that would look like? You know, what a commuter rail car that's powered by diesel or a commuter rail car that's powered by electricity would look like. I mean, we have now upgraded rail service and tracks from Burlington to Rutland. Some between Rutland and Bennington have been upgraded. And at one point during the Dean administration, a lot of money was put in to upgrade the track, I think, to Arlington. So I would like to see that a little bit more focus on things that aren't just cars. And I will point out that this is an extraordinarily beautiful area on Route 7. We're never going to have an interstate. And I think it would do a lot for economic development, as happened when Amtrak expanded rail service to Portland, Maine. It improved the economy all along the line. And I am not advocating for Amtrak, but I do think that a commuter rail would do a lot for to connect the sort of the forgotten part, which is how Bennington refers to itself. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to make that comment.
Thank you, Annette. Any other comments or? It sounded like someone else wanted to chime in.
Well, I was going to attempt to answer to the degree that it seemed like there was a question kind of threaded in there. I guess the one quick thing that I'll say is that, yeah, I mean, all of our strategies aren't just looking at electric vehicles are obviously, a big part of the baseline, but a lot of the strategies we're looking at, again, are looking at mode shift. So it's increased, walking, biking, transit, and rail. It gets tough to model, I think, in terms of modeling like new rail lines, typically that if there's an actual proposed rail line, there will be a big accompanying study and you'll get ridership forecasts from that. It becomes a lot harder to sort of estimate what a new hypothetical line would be. But I think to the extent that rail or other things come out of discussions, we'll make every effort to understand what kind of impact that would have. But yeah, we're really looking at as sort of as much as we can in terms of strategies.
Thank you, Ben. All right, and thanks for letting us know where you are in this report, and I hope we'll hear from you again.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, our next topic is just a quick update on the status of S5, the Affordable Heat Act. As you know, this was a recommendation, Clean Heat Standard was a recommendation of the Climate Action Plan coming from this committee. And just as a matter of short update for the members of the committee who may not have followed it, the Senate voted S5 out about a week ago, and it'll be moving over to the House in coming weeks. I'm not quite sure what this schedule is going to be for that. By way of update, I think it's useful to inform the committee that the bill is largely structured on H715, the bill that was vetoed last year, with one important provision that's pretty much the same as last year, and that is the so-called check back provision, and where the legislation, if it were passed as the Senate wrote it, would require the PUC to develop the rules and do some analysis about implementation of the Affordable Heat Act, and then deliver all of that to the legislature by December of 2024, before adopting rules formally. And that the legislature would then have the session during 2025 to completely review that work and to decide whether to authorize it to go forward. The other significant changes in the legislation in S5 compared to last year's bill are three. There's a provision to strengthen the equity requirements in the bill by continuing to have a significant carve out for low and moderate income households, but to also add to that a requirement that at least half of the measures delivered to those households are long-lived measures that are projected to lower heating bills in those households long-term. There's a significant additional provision with respect to any biofuels that would be credited under the program, a so-called carbon intensity threshold requirement that would eliminate, first of all biofuels under the program are assessed on a life cycle GHG basis, but even that would be further constrained by a carbon intensity threshold requirement that would over time get increasingly strict and eliminate from the program altogether any lower carbon reducing biofuels. And the third major change is a change in the way the default delivery agent is included in the legislation. In last year's bill, a obligated party could choose either to meet its requirement by delivering services or purchasing allowances from somebody else, or it could request that its obligation be satisfied by the default delivery agent appointed by the PUC. This year's legislation flips that, where the default delivery agent, and you know, for thinking about what this looks like, you can sort of think about it as an entity that looks and operates somewhat the way Efficiency Vermont operates. The default delivery agent under S5 is given the responsibility to deliver programs, and a obligated party can choose to say, no, I want to do it myself. But in the absence of their choosing, the DDA would be delivering programs, and that's very similar to the way Efficiency Vermont works today. Most of the utilities in Vermont fulfill their obligation by allowing Efficiency Vermont to do the work. But they have the opportunity, if they want to, and Burlington, for example, has said, no, we want to do it ourselves. So they work in cooperation with Efficiency Vermont, but they kept the obligation themselves. So I think the Senate decided they're going to use that model for the clean heat standard. That was a change from last year's bill. I think that's it, and it's going to the House, and remains to be seen what will happen there. So that gives us now an opportunity to hear an update on the energy, the ANR PSD work on thermal sector analysis, which is part of the study that this committee asked the administration to do, even though we didn't exactly ask them to do this. The work is going forward, and it's been pretty thorough. And TJ, maybe you want to take the next step here.
Sure. I actually am going to turn it over to Brian Woods, who's going to just provide an overview of where we are and the work that has been done so far.
Okay, thank you, TJ, and thank you, Rich. So I see Ben dropped off the call. I wanted to give him kudos. That was a great presentation from the VTrans group. And I also, you kind of heard the trailer of some of my comments from Jane already. So you have a little bit of a preview to work from. I'm certainly wasn't planning on going into the kind of detail that you heard from Ben. And I don't have the benefit of having a contractor available, but I think I can provide most of the information that folks would be interested at this point, and any other questions that you have that we can't answer here, we'll certainly follow up with everybody, except that's possible. Unless people tell me otherwise, you can see the screen share that I have up. For just a little bit of background for folks that might not be familiar how we got to where we are now. ANR entered into a contract with the Energy Futures Group team, and that includes Cadmus and Stockholm Environment Institute. Those are the folks that have designed the Vermont Pathways Report, and they're the experts in the LEAP model. So we had a contract with them in January of 2023 for this analysis of policy options to reduce emissions from the building's thermal energy sector. This work's being managed by staff from the Public Service Department and Climate Action Office, specifically Melissa Bailey and TJ. from there, and Jane Lazorchak and myself from the Climate Action Office. Also involved is the Buildings and Thermal Energy Task Group. That's currently Christine Donovan, Dave Farnsworth, Rich, and Jared. They have been and they'll continue to be engaged as the project reaches specific milestones. So the project work scope, which I have in a kind of a abbreviated section shared on the screen, includes these 5 elements: this qualitative analysis of policy options, and that's been completed. It was included in the meeting invitation or the meeting post on the calendar. And I know some folks have already started to look at that. And I also posted a link to it in the chat for folks. There's the selection of the 5 policy sets for the quantitative analysis. And I'll go into those later, but those have been selected. As you heard again in the trailer, there's the update to the Vermont Pathways LEAP baseline reference case. So that's in progress, and the SEI team is, currently working with the existing LEAP model, basically to update it regards to new information, particularly regarding funding. So IIJA and IRA funding, some of the state funding that's going towards additional weatherization, some modified assumptions regarding penetration of technologies. And we had a good meeting with the task group and the contractor to go over in detail some of the updated assumption sets that are going into that model. And as Jane indicated, there's 2 things that we're waiting for. One of them, Jane indicated, this was the Energy Information Agency annual energy outlook. It's actually supposed to drop today at 2 o'clock. That will be used primarily, but maybe not exclusively, for updated fuel pricing forecasts. That'll go into the model. And then I've also asked PSD if they have any suggestions or updates to the Vermont electricity load forecast from the one that's in the existing model. And I'm working with TJ on that. And so we hope to incorporate those changes as well. And and the result will be this updated baseline reference case for the Vermont Pathways model that will be the basis for the quantitative analysis of the policy sets that I'll discuss briefly. In addition, and this analysis is primarily going to be outputs from LEAP, but not exclusively. The contract team is also developing these complementary workbooks for things that we can't calculate internally, for customer economics, rate and fuel price impact, and program and administrative costs. They are working on those workbooks. We're actually meeting with them tomorrow to see the initial outputs from those workbooks. There'll be a draft report, and then there is a final analysis and a report, and that's currently on schedule for delivery in late May or early June. Oops, just go over here.
Brian, can I interrupt and ask a question?
Oh, sure.
Can you, in terms of the development of complementary workbooks, looking at rate and fuel price impacts, how are you getting those numbers? Like what's the baseline of information about fuel price that you're using? And how are you estimating impact or calculating it?
As I said, we're going to have our initial meeting with the on that topic with the EFG group tomorrow. They talked about it at a very high level in their proposal and in the contract. So we'll be getting into those details tomorrow. As I mentioned, I think, there'll also be, for fuel price forecasts, we'll be looking for that federal government report to inform that as well. So, but I think the best answer to that is we'll have much more detailed information after we have our meeting with them.
Thank you.
Other questions? Jared?
I just want to note briefly, first, thanks again for the overview and presentation, Brian. If you can just go up 1 second, there's just one thing I want to flag that has come up in discussion on the Science and Data Subcommittee. No in-depth deliberation or action has been taken on it, but I see that on that fourth bullet point where you talk about the development of the complementary workbooks on social cost, last year, the council approved a figure for the social cost of carbon for Vermont, which I assume will be kind of utilized in the development of those workbooks. I do think that is an area, though, that is changing quickly. We've seen a new report in the last year from Resources for the Future, which was the original basis for the New York numbers we were using, that updated their analysis, and that number is now higher. And the Federal Environmental Protection Agency also just released, is now using, after conducting additional analysis, a higher number for the social cost of carbon than we are. I think to formally revise or adjust the social cost of carbon that is in the climate action plan is a longer process. But in the meantime, I do think that given that we are at odds with what the federal number is now, and that's something that we had referenced in the report, at the very least, that might be something that is worth a sensitivity analysis there to compare the federal EPA number versus what Vermont used in our climate action plan a couple of years ago. Just want to note that. We can come back to it and discuss it in further depth, but I wanted folks on this committee to know that that conversation has come up, and I think we'll need to advance, at least starting in the Science and Data Subcommittee at some point in the coming year, certainly ahead of the revision or a future cap, because I think it's already clear, as we anticipated, that already a year in that number is out of date and not in line with what the kind of leading analysts of social cost of carbon are now reporting.
Thanks, Jared. So the contract called for, it identified 6 policy options for the qualitative analysis. The idea was we do this kind of screening level analysis to identify the policies that would move ahead to the more comprehensive quantitative analysis that we're just at the beginning of. So those 6 are the ones at the top, including this bundle of expansion of existing policies and programs. And then part of the contract was to work with the contractor to identify any additional policy or policy options that we wanted to run through that qualitative analysis. And those are the 4 that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. Just pause for a moment. And these are all in the report.
Yeah, since they're not numbered, when you say the 4 at the bottom of the screen, how do they differ from the ones in the middle of the screen?
So, well, fossil fuel infrastructure moratorium is, it's unlike anything that's above.
What I understand, they're all different. I wondering how you are clustering them. There's expansion of existing programs, then there's carbon pricing, cap and trade, performance standards, and direct regulation. And you're just saying that these 4 at the bottom are just kind of extra program ideas that are being looked at.
I might suggest that this was the categories that we used for the qualitative analysis. And once you see the way that we've put forward the 5 policy options, it might be a little clearer how some were put together, like direct carbon pricing. We're thinking about it as a fuel surcharge, and that would fund that, and it would have to be high enough to fund the expansion of existing policies and programs to meet the emission reductions, so that that becomes one policy option in the quantitative analysis.
Okay. I mean, I've read the report. I'm asking the question for the benefit of someone who might not have read it.
Yeah.
right.
I figured it.
Moving. Okay, lots of options being looked at. Adam
Right.
and then Bram.
Ryan, just a quick question. I'm curious about the policy options. Maybe this will be addressed in the qualitative versus quantitative, but LEAP is, my knowledge, not a predictive model, and it's an accounting framework. So I'm curious how like policy scenarios from I think maybe it'd be helpful just for everyone in the committee to understand what the LEAP model does and like what inputs are going in, what the expected outputs are, just so that they understand like what the value of LEAP is and make sure that it's not misconstrued as a predictive model.
That's a good point, and I will try and do it succinctly for a couple of reasons, because I don't want to pretend that that I can describe this in great detail. But yes, you're exactly right, Adam, that the LEAP model is this a very sophisticated accounting framework for establishing or calculating what emissions would be on particular mixes of technology deployments based upon emission factors that are associated with them. But in the model, you can connect sectors like heating with fuel types, both high emitting fuels or lower emitting fuels are options like electricity, and develop scenarios, these are examples of scenarios that will show what your emissions trajectory would be over a period of time. One of the important, and when I move to the quantitative options, it'll be a little bit easier, but you're right. In LEAP, we're going to need to work with the contractor to be able to develop the quantitative scenarios in a way that LEAP can understand them. So we're going to need to parameterize them. So Rich was just talking about S5, the clean heat standard, for example. We all know that there's a lot of decisions about how that program's going to be designed that still need to be made through the Public Utility Commission process. So we're going to have to make assumptions about, emission factors, both, direct emission factors, because the outputs from LEAP, from the Pathways report, were designed to say, as the Global Warming Solutions Act says, you need to account for emissions the way we do it in the inventory. But the clean heat standard, that accounts for emissions reductions on a life cycle basis. So we're going to need to work with the contractor to be able to, make that, that conversion between, emissions reductions from fuel switching, and particularly for clean heat measures, and how they're actually would be accounted for in the inventory, because that's the units of compliance that are in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So that's one example, but for every selected policy or policy set, we're going to need to parameterize it so that, and say, LEAP, we want you to have this many vehicles, we want you to deploy this many heat pumps, we want to do, this much of that, in order to be able to have LEAP do the work that it does and tell us what the emissions trajectory is going to be. So yeah, it's not a predictive tool. There is an optimization module, but it certainly isn't. We say we want to meet this emission reduction trajectory and model, you figure out the best way or the least expensive way for us to do it. You're exactly right. It does not work that way. And some of the work is going to need to be, it's like how in a world where we have a basically a limited set of technologies to be able to deploy in the heating sector, alternative fuels and electrification. How do different policy sets actually result in different mixes of technologies in order to be able to achieve a particular reduction requirement?
So, Glenn, you might have a lot more to do, so I'll urge you to move along.
Okay. I actually just have one more.
Oh, okay.
So the contractor performed the qualitative analysis. The results of that are in the report. And based on the results of that, and we did have a meeting with the task group, and we came up with these 5 policy sets for the quantitative analysis going forward. So it's expansion of the existing policies and programs that are outlined in the previous slide, plus fuel surcharge in order to be able to fund that. And the idea is that these existing policies would be expanded in a way in order to meet the 2030 and 2050 reductions. Then there's the sector-wide performance standard, or the clean heat standard. Cap and invest in the buildings and thermal energy sector only. Cap and invest for the main thermal and transportation fuels. And then this regulatory measures bundle. So, a series of regulations that could be imposed, and with the idea that they be designed, again, to be able to meet the reduction standards. And as I just mentioned in response to Adam's question, we're going to need to do some work to be able to parameterize all these as LEAP scenarios in order for the analysis to be run.
Thanks, Brian. Christine?
Yeah, I want to make a couple of comments. One is, I think I'm very pleased to see the collaboration between A&R and PSD and overseeing this work. And I think the EFG team is very well suited to do this work. In my view, what I call the green, yellow, pink table, which is a 1 or 2 page table in the deliverable that is linked in the announcement for this meeting, is really the executive summary of the work that's been done so far. And it's a very visually easy to understand way of assessing these range of qualitatively assessing these range of various policy options compared to each other relative to a set of, I don't know, about 5 or 7 criteria that the consultants were asked to use, like cost of metric ton of greenhouse gas reduced. Will this generate revenue that could be used, by the state for a variety of ways, et cetera, et cetera. And I would encourage people, I think that's the fastest, quickest way to understand the work that's been done so far and the basis for moving from the longer list that was in the qualitative analysis to now the shorter list that will be forwarded into the quantitative analysis. And if I were fast on my feet, I'd pull that up and share my screen, but I don't want to bog the meeting down.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Yeah, I can refer people to that. It is linked in the report.
Yeah, I agree with Christine. That's a really useful summary. There was only one observation to make, and Jane has already addressed it, and so have you, Brian. In the assessment of best, better, and problematic that's included in that summary, the expansion of existing policies and programs does not inherently include in it the necessity of having a fuel surcharge or a new source of revenue from somewhere to finance the expansion of all those programs. And that has to be implicitly understood, that we have a great suite of existing programs in the state, but if we wanted to expand them sufficiently to meet the carbon reduction goals, revenue's got to be raised somewhere. And that leads to a question, which is for you or Jane, is the fuel surcharge that's contemplated to be modeled carbon-based, or is it just a kind of a black box, we need this much money?
I think we haven't determined that yet. You're exactly right that in the original screening it doesn't say how to fund those programs and policies. Again, at a very high level, I think the way the analysis of that policy needs to be is build the scenario, scale up those policies in order to be able to meet the reductions and see what that requires. And then LEAP will say, and that, in order to be able to deploy these technologies at this scale, this is what that's going to cost. And then you can say, now we have a figure, and how do we apply a surcharge on fuels, all fuels, on our carbon content of fuels, whatever we want to do. What are the options to be able to raise that amount of money? What do they look like?
Yeah, and Brian is exactly right. And we had a really robust conversation with the contractor about this last week. And because our colleagues at PSD weren't around, we sort of chose to kick the can to our meeting this week to make some decisions on it. I'll just say that there are a lot of different ways you can sort of think about how the money will be raised. I think the critical question for us in this phase of understanding is what it will cost to expand programs to meet the emissions reductions requirements. And then if moving forward with that, there'll be a myriad of options sort of to think about how we would fund that, and whether it's through a direct fuel charge, whether it's on all fuel sources, and whether it includes electricity or not. Those are the kinds of questions, or carbon intensity. Understanding that there's also funding available to us around through the Inflation Reduction Act that could then also cut that cost down.
Christine?
Yeah, I must say, my takeaway when I revisited what I call the blue, yellow, pink table again today was, it's wow, that table does it. It makes it really clear that there is going to have to be one or more new approaches that generate revenue in order to even just expand the existing programs. And I thought it just makes it really clear that it's not a question of whether, it's a question of which, and that it may be more than one which, and that it's going to be it's going to be buckshot, multiple actions and policies and potential regulation working in concert with each other. And that was my takeaway from the table for myself anyway.
Thanks, Christine.
Bridget, may I make one more comment right now?
Please.
And maybe I'll invite TJ to speak to this also, but one of the comments that has come up quite a bit through public commentary around the Affordable Heat Act has been the consideration of the cost of meeting the 2030 reduction requirements versus meeting the reduction requirements in 2035. Mindful, I fully understand there's a law that mandates us to meet them by 2030, but understanding the cost differences. And so I want to put that forward because the way that the contract was written for these 5 policy options is we wanted to understand what it would cost to meet the 2030 emissions reductions, and then what it would cost if we were looking at 2050. 2050 feels, very far away. Understanding the ramp up, it's less certain. There are challenges associated with modeling out that far. So we've been talking with the contractor about meeting the 2030 reduction requirements, or what would be the cost difference to meeting the requirements in, say, 2035 is just one example. And how different that would be, and understanding how LEAP works. It would essentially be a whole nother policy set to run it for different time horizons. And so I just wanted to flag that we're currently talking with the contractor about sort of what the timeline would be and what the cost estimate would be to take any one of these 5 policy options and understand the difference of what the suite of technologies are needed, what the cost would be to scale up on a longer runway. And we don't want to slow down the deliverables associated with this contract, but also want to have that information, maybe not for all 5, but maybe for the 3 best or 2. And so we are planning to pursue that after we advance the quantitative analysis for these 5. And I think that just relates to one of the additions to the Affordable Heat Act, also that I don't think we discussed a few minutes ago, which is the potential study that was added to the Affordable Heat Act. Something that I know we at A&R and I don't want to get out in front of PSD because we're going to talk about it with them tomorrow, but it's something we're very interested in, the potential study, and I'm interested in maybe if TJ just wants to explain briefly what the potential study is that was added to the Affordable Heat Act and how it mirrors the work that PSD does for Efficiency Vermont currently.
Good point, Jane. Thank you.
Sure. So a lot of folks might be familiar, but I think it goes along with what Rich was saying in that the Senate really started to shape the Affordable Heat Act or model it based on what is done for our electric energy efficiency utilities. In that process, before we set their budgets, before we have a process before the commission to set their budgets, there's a potential study. What is the potential for efficiency in that case, over a set time horizon. And there's different types of potential. There's a technical, and they all kind of are concentric circles. And the biggest circle is really the technical potential. Like if you had no limitations, what is the technical potential that you could achieve, even in year one without any workforce limitations, money, whatever. And then below that, there's economic potential. And so you say, okay, how much of this is economic? And you use assumptions like fuel price from in our case here, as Brian mentioned, looking at the annual energy outlook to look at trends in fuel prices. That would, in the efficiency world, we do that from a societal perspective, use the social cost of carbon. And we also look at it from a program, a ratepayer perspective. So a couple of the perspectives that you see here. And then there's below that, there's achievable potential, because even if you give people 100% incentives and pay for them, not everybody will do it. We don't have the workforce to ramp up weatherization immediately. So it kind of takes into it provides more and more limitations on what you could actually achieve. And so I think that's what the potential study would look like. And it was recommended by the Public Utility Commission, again, kind of modeling off of that structure. I think there's some value in it, although in the thermal sector, we do know that there are significant limitations on what we can do. So the value is kind of after the next several years where we have significant federal money and we're already limited in what we can do. And the value will be for those like 2027, 28 on to like 2035. Those will be the most, we'll get the most value out of the analysis in that time frame for what we might be able to do. So that is added to the Affordable Heat Act and can be informative, but we won't have that in time for this study that we're working on.
TJ, thanks very much. Are there other comments from members of the committee? Because we should turn to any public comments on this part of the agenda. Jared?
Thanks for that description, TJ. I look forward to that. I think it's always good to learn and share more about technical, economic, and achievable potential. Just to go back a second, though, to what you were saying, Jane. I mean, my sense is that we as a climate council were given a legal obligation and a public duty to achieve the legal requirements and to put forward plans that can do that, and to do analysis in line with complying with the law. So I would just suggest that to me, it does not feel appropriate or in line with the charge that we were given to do modeling that would assume that we don't meet our legal obligation or don't comply with the law. So this idea of kind of arbitrarily saying, well, it's not what the Global Warming Solutions Act says, but we'll model meeting 2030 emissions reduction numbers 5 years late in 2035. I don't see the value in that exercise. I see the value in potential studies. I see the value in looking out at different timeframes. But to me, that's just right up front inconsistent with the legal charge that we were given and the obligation we have. So I don't know why we would do it.
Thanks, Jared. TJ?
Yeah, just to speak to that, I think one of the things that we don't talk about that is included in the GWSA is that the plan needs to provide cost-effective solutions, or I'm paraphrasing there, but it needs to look at cost effectiveness, we'll just say. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that you can frame what cost effectiveness is, but one of those, I'll just use the transportation sector as an example, because I think it's easy to talk about it, is that, you know, the clean cars, advanced clean cars rulemaking, clean trucks rulemaking gets us for part of the way there. By 2030. We have the carbon reduction strategy that'll get us a little bit further. Probably still a gap there, as we all identified, but we get there by 2033 or 2034, whatever the year is, and we should be looking at, okay, well, what is the cost? You know, what's the cost of moving that up 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, whatever the number is, and what are the carbon benefits based on the social cost of carbon? And is that, you know, what's the equation there? And I think that's a really fair thing to look at when, you know, the targets in the GWSA are for Vermont, or, you know, just they're set based on kind of a global standard, but we don't know, you know, the baseline is different in Vermont, that, you know, there's a lot more you know, electric reductions elsewhere. Just it's just a fair thing to look at in terms of what's cost effective for Vermont and what that act means for Vermonters, and is it cost effective to wait 2 years? So I did that in the transportation sector because it's a little easier to explain, but I think it's fair to do that in the thermal sector as well and say, hey, what is this cost effective, and what are the options? What happens if we meet this on a different time frame?
Jared, it looks like you put your hand back up again. I'd like to.
I'll just briefly respond, if that's okay. And I just want to say, TJ, I totally agree with you that the Global Warming Solutions Act talks about the importance of cost effectiveness as a criteria, which clearly we built into the climate action plan. I would just say, I think we have a difference of opinion on this. I read that as we have a responsibility to utilize cost effectiveness as a criteria when we compare policies against each other to meet our legal obligation, not, you know, so how does policy A compare to policy B in terms of cost effectiveness when we meet, you know, in terms of meeting the 2030 emissions reduction legal requirements? I don't think that the legislature asked us to review and revise the targets in the Global Warming Solutions Act. I read the law as those are the legal requirements. We do analysis and make recommendations to achieve them. I think that's settled law. If some folks want to go back to that, I know that there are proposals out there around getting rid of it or changing it, but I think as long as it is the law of the land, we need to work to meet that legal obligation and do analysis aligned with that, and including cost effectiveness, which is very important. But that to me is the relative cost effectiveness of different strategies to comply with that obligation, not to not comply with settled law.
Thanks, Jared, Bram?
So, I think at some point I said, look, if we can reduce carbon by 10,000 tons this year or next year, and doing it this year would cost $1 million, and doing it next year will cost $10,000 because there's a new tech coming online, we'd probably all say, we'll wait a year and we'll do that same reduction for $10,000 instead of $1 million. However, it's never going to be that clear. And I think it most likely that you're going to have to spend the same amount of money, and whether you do it in 2 years or 5 years. So the question is really going to be, can we corral all the cash by 2030 to get it done, or do we just not have enough cash? And it's the same technology and the same program, but instead of doing it by 2030 because we don't have enough money, we have the budget to do it over by 2033 or something. So I think that is much more likely the hard decision that we're going to have to face. And, fair enough, if we get into that position, we can absolutely go to the legislature and say, look, to hit this goal, we need more money. We just don't know any other way to do it. And more money, we're going to be 3 years later, 5 years later, whatever it is. So I think we should probably expect to face those kind of tough decisions.
Thanks, Bram. I would like to make sure we have a little time at the end to talk about future meetings. Any further comments from committee members or members of the public? So thoughts about future meetings. It seems to me we've got some major work projects, proceeding both in transportation and in thermal, and that planning to hear back on the results of that work seems like a prudent thing for us to do. I'll state a couple of things, and then I'm just going to pause and ask other people to comment about what they think we should be doing. Should we devote a meeting to hearing about what other states are doing? Should we think about a joint meeting with ag and ecosystems on the mitigation potential in agriculture, or is it just something that we've decided this committee isn't going to focus on because we're going to let the other committee do it? Should we try to schedule some information sessions and some thinking around industrial emissions and challenges and opportunities in industry? And I'll stop there. Those are all possible topics for future discussion. Now, I want to reiterate something that was, reiterated at the, we know that the biomass working group's recommendations are going to be taken up by the full council. So I'm not ignoring that, but that's something that was talked about at the council meeting a couple days ago. Other topics. Okay. Floor is open. TJ and then Jane.
So I have a comment on this, but I just wanted to leave a space here. We just had a thermal conversation and didn't, we were about to, and then we got into this other conversation, but we didn't explicitly ask if members of the public wanted to comment on the thermal. So I just.
Oh, I thought I did, TJ.
You did, and then Jared and I went back and forth, and
I did again.
Community members, but I don't think we count. So.
No.
Okay, so I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand. Please do so if you. This is that as we well, one other topic too is kind of alternative thermal supply and talking about biofuels and learning about that. But as we think about one of these options or other options, I think it'd be really useful for us to frame out to what end, what do, you know, at the end of the year or in November or whenever the date, what do we want to have as a result? Are we trying to recommend something? Is there an area where we want, this committee is putting specific input onto a specific issue? Or is our role as, you know, giving feedback on the various reports that we just heard about today, like we did today? Or is it a combination of those two things? The full climate council had on Monday was just talking about that same council writ large of like, what is the role that it's playing in these kind of policy debates, like at the legislature, out, you know, with the public, et cetera, and is creating a process map. But even within that, I think we need to have kind of think through a longer time frame instead of just like one meeting at a time, so that we're working towards and making really good use of everybody's time and working towards what we think is kind of a agreed goal or outcome, whether it's recommendations or just feedback, etc.
I'm inviting comments from committee members on that topic. And meanwhile, Jane.
I just wanted to offer that the Agency of Natural Resources is opting in for climate pollution reduction grants with support from other agencies most closely aligned with PSD and VTrans, as well as other members of the Interagency Advisory Board to the Climate Action Office. That grant is due at the end of April, and we will present to the council sort of the deliverables and timelines and explain the work of the Climate Action Office over the course of the next year. But that will be specifically focused on cutting climate pollution, and so would be happy to make a more detailed presentation to cross-sector and explain the work in government happening around that.
Thanks, Jane. Let's make a note to hear that report. Bram.
So I think to TJ's point that we should figure out what it is we're trying to accomplish this year, and then we can lay out the work between now and the end of the year goal. From my point of view, there are two things that we've identified, and one is replacing TCI with something else that can achieve the transportation reductions, and the other is finishing our biomass recommendations. And relative to transportation, as we're talking through all the work that's going on at the agency relative to the carbon reduction strategy, I wonder if, talking to Michelle when we were all together, would it be helpful if some of the transportation working group people joined you guys in working on the carbon reduction strategy, and we sort of merged those two efforts, so we're not duplicating effort and we're kind of one team working on one plan?
So I'll, without going into too much detail about the climate pollution reduction grants right now, the $3 million planning grant that will come to ANR, but support likely work not only in ANR, but in other agencies as well, will be very focused the first year on a priority climate action plan that will really be looking at the role of government, is the way we're framing it, in implementing and prioritizing the climate action plan. Further out deliverables very much align with the update to the climate action plan. And that will be more like a year from now, in starting to, with an eye towards the revision to the climate action plan due until July 2025. So this first planning priority work will really be focused in government. And so I think that it'll be beholden on us to be coordinating and keeping the council and subcommittees apprised, because that work will be the basis then for updates to the climate action plan later on. But I don't really think right now there's a direct role to align with task groups and other things right now. Jared, do you have a comment on that or something else maybe?
You're muted.
Thanks. Not directly on that, but related to the work planning and timeline. Just wanted to, so I can save that if somebody else has something more direct in response to what you were saying, Jane.
Bram, were you asking about the carbon reduction strategy and the transportation task group?
Yeah, I was sort of saying, hey, if if
Really closely saying.
There's no sense in duplicating work, and Michelle had said, oh, there's so few of us and there's so much work to do, and I'm just wondering if we can be helpful, if sort of members of the transportation working group could volunteer. If that goes dormant while the work on the carbon reduction plan is ongoing, then that meeting's not on our calendar every week. We've got some time and could volunteer to be helpful if we can.
Yeah, I think we can definitely think of ways. A lot of the people that are on the transportation task group are involved in the carbon reduction strategy, but not everyone. So yeah, I think we can definitely think of ways to do that. And I think that will happen to some degree naturally, just because as we get into more of this evaluation, who sort of the subject matter experts in the state are, and the need for our consultants to coordinate with them. We've done that a little bit already with the methodology, figuring out who has, the experience and expertise in the state. So I can't imagine that wouldn't happen with the strategy evaluation too. So yeah, I think maybe we can talk about that a little bit more on Monday when we meet, because I think we are meeting on Monday as a task group.
I want to set, well, I don't know if I should be the one, but setting expectations for that. If the report for the carbon reduction strategy isn't going to be done till November, and then there's still a gap, or I see that, and maybe I'm wrong, that's kind of a state government initiative that the council can kind of be involved with and advise, but there's the council, if in what Bram, you were saying, is if you're trying to accomplish replacing TCI with something else, then if we're waiting for the carbon reduction strategy to be done to decide what that something else is, that's not going to happen by the end of the year, I feel like. And so I don't know that it's productive to do kind of a parallel path and kind of say, well, we need something else, but I don't know if that's the right end goal. And I might suggest that we devote a good chunk of our next meeting to actually figuring out what this should be, and like our path forward, like some real work planning. And I don't know, maybe there's a smaller group that wants to do that. I'm happy as one of the co-chairs to kind of think about that a little bit and mapping out the next several months, and then bringing that back if there's others that are interested in joining.
Thanks, TJ. I think we do need a smaller working group to chew on this, and that should involve you. And I'll take volunteers. Certainly, I am volunteering. Bram, great. Jared, a comment from you, and then Christine.
I was going to go back to the work planning question and pick up on something you mentioned, Rich. I mean, I do think so much of our work, it makes sense to me to orient it or working backwards from the next climate action plan, and then any remaining revisions to the current climate action plan that need to move forward, as Bram and TJ were just talking about. And, I do think there's questions about that timeline and how, transportation policy recommendations align with the carbon reduction strategy and any other analysis we may get. But I really see the main point I want to offer is that I really see the next year as an opportunity and really a responsibility to do a lot more data gathering, learning, especially from other states, because so much of what we do, it's important to either be aware of and or explore the possibility of possible policy, learning from, if not, and potentially even direct coordination. I mean, New York State has passed or is working towards an economy-wide cap and invest program. We have other jurisdictions that have global warming solutions acts or their equivalents that are most of our neighbors in the New England region. And they are wrestling with the same questions we are about primary policy strategies post TCI in the transportation sector and what to do in the buildings thermal sector. So I do think, I know some of that can happen directly with counselors reading reports from other states and reaching out to counterparts. I know the Climate Action Office is doing that with some of their counterparts in other state government. But I do think that there could be a possibility for using some of our future cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting time to invite people from other states who are doing the exact same work that we're doing to learn from them and compare notes and be aware of what is coming down, what they're looking ahead to, and is that something we want to learn from and potentially collaborate on, and they might be interested in some of what we're doing as well. I think this is that time to make sure we know as much as possible about other strategies, what else is happening in region-wide or other states to inform any revisions we would consider and vote on, and the next cap.
Thank you, Jared. I take that you're volunteering to meet with the work planning group. Christine.
I'm not volunteering to meet with the work planning group, but I do think it might be helpful when we are discussing the next round of work planning to, at a very high level, remind ourselves of where we fit in this very large climate action ecosystem. And I'm not suggesting we map all the different components of that ecosystem, because it's gotten delightfully complex and robust and across multiple agencies and entities. But I do think it would be helpful for us to remind ourselves what our role is, like relative to the Climate Council, and it may actually be understood to be something different now than what we thought it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago when this was getting launched. And then that will help me, for example, help us do work planning to sort of better understand where we believe we sit now, which I think is different because now we have the whole climate office. There's a lot of state agency staff involved. My memory of the climate action plan is, while I know full well the Climate Council owns that plan, it seemed to me that that plan, the substance of what was in that plan, came from the heads of the people on this subcommittee. And there was a lot of day-to-day work done by this subcommittee to create what became the substance in the climate action plan, and the articulation largely of that substance refined by state staff. My guess is it'll play out differently next time, and my husband and my schedule and our lives would be grateful for that. But I don't think if you asked us each right now to describe our role and where we fit, we'd have very closely aligned answers.
Christine, thanks a bunch for that perspective. And I in response only would say that it may be true with respect to the mitigation portions of the climate plan, what you said, but the other major sections of the plan where obviously didn't come from this committee, they came from the other committees. But
No, yeah.
I'll ask the work planning committee when we discuss what's our role to think about what you just said. That is, what's our role now, not what was our role 2 years ago. I think it's time for us to call this meeting to a close. I want to thank the presenters. I want to thank the committee members. Joey, you have a comment?
Well, I just am gonna, and capturing the to-dos in my note-taking capacity. TJ, Rich, Bram, Jared, and Megan are gonna work together to put together a draft plan for the cross-sector mitigations focus, working back from June 2025. Is that accurate? Great.
Thanks. And Joey, thank you for taking the minutes.
Yeah, I've asked for, and we'll synthesize some of the substance, some of it, tried to capture a lot.
All right.
There you
Joey,
go.
you can send the document to me when you're all set and I can put it online. Thank you.
Excellent, no problem. Thank
All
you all.
right.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Joey, for
Thanks,
taking notes.
everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Enjoy the sunshine.